If we want to have a self-governing people, if we want to continue to have a constitutional republic, and we want to have the ability to not just express our thoughts, but to expose lies and to pursue social progress and truth, we have to have the right to speak freely.
You're watching Restoring America, where we shine a light on the fundamental values of this country and all the reasons why they're worth saving. This week, we're going to talk about censorship and whether the United States, which has always prided itself on upholding the freedom of speech, is at risk of abandoning this right. I'm Kaylee McGee-White. Let's get started. The right to speak freely is essential to free government and human flourishing. That's why it's one of the very first liberties preserved in the First Amendment and one of the very first rights totalitarians try to take away. Though the U.S. has long upheld free speech for all, it is not immune to its own authoritarian impulses. The political left especially has become increasingly antagonistic toward opposing points of view that challenge its agenda. Remember Jack Phillips, the Colorado baker who declined to make a cake celebrating same-sex marriage because of his religious beliefs? He might have won at the Supreme Court a few years ago, but he's still in court today, more than a decade later, thanks to leftist activists. And what about those silenced by their own federal government? It's no secret that thousands of Americans were censored online by big tech companies in coordination with the Biden administration because they dared to question COVID governance. The Supreme Court also just ruled on this issue, and you might be shocked by its decision. My guest today is going to help us break down the court's recent ruling in Murphy v. Missouri. But before we get to her, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and for more, head to washingtonexaminer.com. With me today is Kristen Waggoner, the president and CEO of Alliance Defending Freedom and an attorney who has argued before the Supreme Court multiple times. Kristen, thanks very much for being here today. You have argued in front of the Supreme Court extensively about free speech rights, and you talk about this in a new op-ed as well about how censorship is on the rise, not just globally, but right here in the United States. So can you tell us more about the threats that free speech is facing today?
Sure. Well, Alliance Defending Freedom is the largest legal organization that's committed to protecting the rights of free speech, religious freedom, sanctity of life, and parental rights. And what makes us also unique is that we have a global vantage point. We work around the world, and what we're seeing is a trend of censorship, not just in nations that people might think of as censoring or being totalitarian, but actually in Western democracies, to the point now where the United States is the last Western country in the world that is actually resisting hate speech laws that we're seeing blanket Europe and Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. So it's something that's very concerning. It's also something that we see happening on the ground here in our own country, related to the rights that students have on campuses, the rights that teachers have, the rights of counselors and healthcare providers to speak freely, as well as many other areas like small business owners and artists. All of those cases are surfacing through our justice system or have recently been through the justice system.
And speaking of that, you won an important case before the Supreme Court last year, 303 Creative, that dealt directly with this issue, whether the government could compel creative artists and business owners to speak things that violated their religious beliefs. Help us break down this decision and the significance of it for free speech moving forward.
The significance is very easy to state in that what we see abroad is that censorship blurs the lines between democracies and dictatorships. It's that clear when you look outside of the United States. If we want to have a self-governing people, if we want to continue to have a constitutional republic, and we want to have the ability to not just express our thoughts, but to expose lies and to pursue social progress and truth, we have to have the right to speak freely. And the court has said that again and again. But in this most recent Supreme Court decision in 303 Creative, governments at the state level were taking the position that they could force artists to create speech and messages that they disagreed with. In the 303 Creative case, it involved Lori Smith, which was a website designer, and she was asked to create custom websites that violated her beliefs that marriage was between a man and a woman. And the court thankfully affirmed the precedent that said the government can't force you to say things that you don't believe. I'll also just raise this, though, as we think of the rising tide of censorship, we're also seeing it through the government imposing censorship through third parties, indirectly through pressure. And we're seeing it in the context of big tech and banks. For example, debanking people because they have articulated political or religious views that the government's ideology disagrees with.
Well, I'm glad you bring this up because we know just last month the Supreme Court released another decision refusing to strike down the Biden administration for allegedly coordinating with big tech companies to censor Americans who were critical of COVID governance. What do you make of this decision, and will we come to regret it, as Justice Samuel Alito wrote in his dissent?
I hope we don't come to regret it, but I'm not optimistic. And the reason I say that is we know that justice denied or justice delayed is justice denied in some instances. So, for example, Jack Phillips of Masterpiece Cake Shop, he's been in litigation. It's his third case because the court didn't initially rule on the speech question in his case about cakes. And now he's still litigating 12 years later. There's a real cost to kicking the can down the road. And there is no question, and the Supreme Court did not dispute, that this type of censorship is occurring. In fact, we know from another case this term called the NRA case that government regulators, for example, in New York, were threatening banks and insurance companies to essentially deplatform the NRA. If they didn't agree to deplatform them, those banks and insurance companies would face consequences from the government. So let me just close with this on these two cases. I think that the NRA decision this term, which says that the government cannot indirectly do what the First Amendment forbids directly, meaning it can't use third parties to censor speech, that is a very clear ruling that the Supreme Court held. In the Murthy case, the case you just referenced, the court said that the litigants didn't have the standing to pursue the case, meaning it didn't rule on the substance of the legal claims, which is what makes the NRA decision so important. But all of us need to understand the Constitution is the longest enduring constitution in the history of the world. Every Western democracy and many nations have these protections. The only thing that makes them work is the citizens insisting that the courts and legislators abide by our fundamental rights.
Absolutely. Well, Kristen, thank you very much for joining us today and helping us break this down. And for more breaking news, exclusive interviews, and conservative views, be sure to check out washingtonexaminer.com.